Okay, I'm going to officially call tonight's program to order. And I want to welcome all of you, new friends and old alike, to Revolution Books, the bookstore about the world for a radically different world. This is a very unique and vibrant space. It is the political, intellectual, and cultural center for a movement for an actual revolution. At this bookstore, revolution is the foundation for the engagement, for the rich engagement with ideas and with the breadth and depth of what you see embodied in the titles on these bookshelves and in the quality and in the diversity of the speakers that come to this bookstore. And at this bookstore, you discover and can take up a truly scientific approach, a method and approach to understanding what's at the root of the problems that confront the 7 billion on this planet, and what is the way out of this madness. And that is the new synthesis of communism developed by Bob Avakian, and you discover the leadership that he is giving to the revolution to emancipate humanity. So this is a very special institution. It's why we call it Revolution Books. You find books and you find the revolution here. Tonight, we're very excited to have Cheryl Wall. Cheryl is going to be speaking on the theme of the Harlem Renaissance and the journey of its women. Cheryl Wall is the Zora Neale Hurston Professor of English at Rutgers University. She is the author of, among other books, The Harlem Renaissance and the Harlem Women in the Harlem Renaissance, and the Harlem Renaissance, A Very Short Introduction. Now, don't let that title, A Very Short Introduction, fool you, because it is, in its 125 pages or so, incredibly rich, insightful, and evocative. Cheryl is also the editor of Zora Neale Hurston's work, and she has been a lifelong supporter and is committed to the arts thriving. She was a founding director, on the board rather, of New Jersey's first Black theater. So it's very exciting to have Cheryl here, and without further delay, I'm going to bring her to the podium. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. I'd like to begin by thanking Raymond and Jane Sloan of Revolutionary Books. I have to say this is my first time in this space, but it will not be my last time. I just love the energy and I've met so many of the volunteers and members of the staff, and the passion and sense of engagement that everybody here has is very inspiring and invigorating. I am so happy to see so many of you here. I'm thinking, oh my golly, it's a June Wednesday evening, the first day of summer. Who's going to come out to hear about women of the Harlem Renaissance? But here you are. And that makes me very, very happy. So yes, thank you. Now I know that we have in our audience people who are already quite knowledgeable about the Harlem Renaissance, and so I'm going to be calling on you all to share some of that knowledge. There's a class from Hostos College who's here, and they're studying the Harlem Renaissance, and I'm just delighted that you would take time to come out tonight. And I know that many others of you are deeply conversant with this material. But I'm going to start with some very introductory remarks, and this is from the first chapter of the Harlem Renaissance, A Very Short Introduction. I'm going to try to do a combination of reading and speaking, and I hope that's okay. This chapter is entitled When Harlem Was in Vogue. The 20s were, as Langston Hughes remembered them, the period when the Negro was in vogue and, quote, whites flocked to Harlem in droves. In his memoir, The Big C, Hughes offers wry descriptions of the scene, the music, dancing, and nightclubs, fancy balls and house rent parties, and the writers, almost all of whom he knew, respected, and mentioned by name. Hughes lists Gwendolyn Bennett, Countee Cullen, Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, and Wallace Thurman among the Harlem literati. While claiming not to have a critical mind, Hughes deems Jean Toomer, quote, one of the most talented of the Negro writers, although Toomer did not wish to associate with Negroes. Hughes could not resist mocking the pretensions of those who, quote, thought the race problem had at last been solved through art plus Gladys Bentley, a reference that signified on several levels the project of the New Negro Renaissance, as it was then called, was to achieve through art the equality that Black Americans had been denied in the social, political, and economic realms. Segregation was the law in much of the United States and the practice in the rest. Despite the creation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, founded in 1909, and the National Urban League, founded in 1910, the fight for equality had been thwarted. But at a time when the Negro was in vogue, progress on the cultural front seemed possible. Race leaders called for a representation of Negroes as upstanding and respectable citizens. Gladys Bentley was not the emblem readers had in mind. Usually costumed in a white tuxedo and top hat, Bentley sang and played barrel house blues and Tin Pan Alley tunes whose lyrics she raunchily rewrote in clubs that catered to a sexually adventurous clientele. Indeed, she usually played at a place called the Clam House, which was right up the street on 139th Street. The Renaissance itself was a combustible mix of the serious, the ephemeral, the aesthetic, the political, and the risque. It arrived on the heels of the Great War that promised to end all wars. Optimism defined the national mood, and the Renaissance reflected the particular optimism of Black Americans. Black men had fought for the right to fight in the war, and having proven their patriotism on the battlefield, these veterans returned intent on claiming their citizenship rights. Their mood and the social realities they encountered did not mesh. The decade after the war saw anti-Black riots, a growing number of lynchings, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Yet, Black people mobilized and in some cases prospered. Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, preached race pride and the gospel of Africa for the Africans, while Madam C.J. Walker became the first Black woman millionaire by selling hair straightening products. Jazz, with its syncopated rhythms and improvisations, its fusion of Tin Pan Alley and the blues, caught the contradictions that defined the age. I'm going to stop there, and that's kind of the mapping of the Harlem Renaissance that is pretty familiar to those of you who have read David Levering Lewis's book When Harlem Was in Vogue, or Nathan Huggins' book Harlem Renaissance, and they have a sense that Harlem and this moment in history represented a moment of terrific optimism, though that optimism was already circumscribed, right? Because even though people wanted and were fighting for citizenship rights, including the right to vote, including the right to gain an education at schools that people wanted to go to, including the right to be physically safe at a time when there's a kind of racial terrorism. There is a racial terrorism that characterizes the lives of Black people in the rural South. But still, there's this hope, there's this sense that change is possible, and that even though Black people don't have the vote, and even though the economic opportunities are very limited, all of a sudden there's the possibilities in art. There's the sense that Black music is the music of the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald deemed the 1920s the jazz age for a reason, that people can listen to jazz on the radio, that Black social dances like the Charleston become the dances of America, not Black America, of America. And surely this means that something new is possible. And it does. But their optimism was not borne out by the realities. And for women, this kind of optimism, Alain Locke talks about the Great Migration, which is part of the important background of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, and the decade before marked the period when Black people first come to Harlem. This becomes a city within a city in the 1920s. And Alain Locke talked about this move from the feudal to the modern, that all of a sudden there's an abrupt break with the past. For most women writers, that was not their experience. The boogies of the past continued to haunt. And I'd like to read from now the prologue of Women of the Harlem Renaissance to give you a sense of what I mean by that. I sailed in my dreams to the land of night, begins a poem Gwendolyn Bennett published in 1927. Entitled Fantasy, the poem depicts a dreamscape lit by moon-veiled light, which reveals the, quote, loveliest things. Among them a peacock, a garden of lavender hues, and most incredibly, a dusk-eyed queen. The vision of this dark woman inspires the speaker's song. Ruler of the realm, the queen sits in the garden in an amethyst chair with her feet in hyacinth shoes. But even as she directs her song to the queen, the speaker hides herself behind a bush. The concealed speaker might be read as a metaphor for the woman writer of the Harlem Renaissance, a woman half in shadow, as Mary Helen Washington once described Zora Neale Hurston, a woman whose life and work had or have vanished from literary history. Many factors ranging from shifting literary taste to changing notions of value to racism and sexism may account for the writer's neglect. Most puzzling are those instances where the writer, like Bennett's speaker, has collaborated in her disappearance. But her song lingers and testifies to her existence. Inverting the symbolism of light and dark was a favorite strategy of Harlem Renaissance poets. Rather than invoking ignorance or terror, the land of night is a place of magical beauty. One assumes the dusk-eyed, dark-haired queen is also dark-skinned, but since she commands a realm where racial designations are not required, the speaker need not say. The poet recognizes that such a realm is the stuff of fantasy, but the land of night remains the designation of the speaker's dreams, remains the destination of the speaker's dreams. In the process of the journey, she acquires her voice. Metaphors of travel recur in writing by Harlem Renaissance women. Despite the restrictions against it, they traveled widely, in fact and in their imaginations. Bennett is an apt example. Has anybody here ever heard of Gwendolyn Bennett? Okay, I have one person. You look Gwendolyn Bennett up. She's an interesting poet. She was born in Giddings, Texas in 1902. That must be a very small town, Giddings, Texas. She grew up in Washington, D.C., Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Brooklyn, New York. After graduating from Pratt Institute in 1924, she joined the Fine Arts faculty of Howard University in Washington, D.C., and then spent a year studying painting in Paris. Her letters home recount her encounters with Ernest Hemingway and Henri Matisse. She allows that, quote, "This year in Paris has been a revelation to me, so far as modern work is concerned." In one letter, she promises a friend that she will make a camouflage cover so she can spirit his copy of James Joyce's scandalous novel Ulysses through the mail. In another, she reports on the sensation made by the show Le Revue Negre, which starred Josephine Baker and which Bennett had not seen. Despite her being in the vortex of modernist culture, the tone of her letters is more often melancholy than not. Young, black, and female, she finds Paris a cold and lonely place. She is relieved to get, quote, "back to the center of things," to New York and to Harlem in June 1926. The imaginary journey depicted in her poem seems altogether happier than her real-life experience. But it was perhaps the product of her travels abroad. Certainly the palette of lavenders from which she painted the metaphors of the poem owes something to her study of art. Now, when we think about the Harlem Renaissance, I mean, I've mentioned some writers. We know about artists who were not writers who were important during the Harlem Renaissance? Anybody want to give an example? Somebody who's not a writer. And for now, I'm even going to make it easy and say, if you can think of a female artist, that's fine. But we'll take male artists too. Who are some artists who were not writers? Yes.
Augusta Savage?
Augusta Savage, absolutely, a visual artist who taught right here in Harlem. In fact, she taught at a school on 135th Street between Lenox and Fifth Avenue during the 1930s. Okay, anybody else? You have another name? Yes. Billie Holiday is a little bit later, but thank you, because Billie Holiday said that she learned from two important artists who were the major influences on her art. One was Louis Armstrong, and the other was Bessie Smith. Both really important figures during the Harlem Renaissance. And I saw one hand back there. Anybody else? Oh my gosh. All right, Archibald Motley Jr. I have an image of one of his paintings in this very short introduction. Absolutely. The Harlem Renaissance is not just about literature. It's also about music. It's also about visual art. It's also about politics. All of those things are interacting to produce what we think of now as the Harlem Renaissance. So thank you. Thank you very much. All right. I've said that these artists were in motion. Now, there were so many. There's an essay by a woman named Rita Bonner that was published in 1925, the same year that Alain Locke published the essay and then the anthology, The New Negro, where he says everything has changed. It's like overnight, the movement from the medieval to the modern. Rita Bonner, in an essay called On Being Young, Colored, and a Woman, has a very different take on things. She's a privileged woman. She's a graduate of Radcliffe. She has, in addition to being well educated, she has more money than most black people have. And yet she talks about it's so difficult to travel even from New York to Washington, D.C. without a chaperone. That people will wonder whether she's really respectable. Can you imagine? That's a weight that women in particular carry during this time. Nevertheless, some of them were determined to travel. Has anybody ever heard the name Jessie Fossa? Okay. Who is Jessie Fossa? They say, well, we've heard her name. She was a novelist. In fact, Jessie Fossa wrote 4 novels between 1924 and 1933. The most prolific woman writer of the Harlem Renaissance. She was also an editor. She was the literary editor of The Crisis, the journal founded by W.E.B. Du Bois and the official journal of the NAACP. Fawcett also loved to travel. And in January 1925, Jessie Fossa, who had traveled extensively throughout Europe, broadened the circuit of her travel to include Northern Africa. 1925. Reporting in The Crisis, she wrote with passion about the thrill of being, even if for only a few days, resident in dark Algiers the White, a dweller in Africa itself. As Fawcett explained, White Algiers, the epithet given the city by the French, refers to its topography. Quote, "The city rises white on tiers up the side of a hill, many hills. One might take dark Algiers to be a reference to its people." Describing her arrival, Fawcett wrote that from its harbor, the city offered a vista of brown and black faces, red fezzes, white turbans, white burnesses, and red blanket robes. Quote, "All the strangeness and difference of that life, which starting far, far in the interior of Africa, yet breaks off so abruptly at the southern edge of the Mediterranean, rose instantly to meet us." In an age when the idea of Africa enthralled the imaginations of many Black American intellectuals, Jessie Fossa was one of a handful, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, and Claude McKay, who actually saw the continent face to face. To Fawcett, the images Algiers created were unforgettable, though their meanings were difficult to decipher. Skillfully developing her cinematic metaphor, Fawcett freezes a series of scenes. At one moment, a group of men reminds her of Old Testament patriarchs. A couple comes into view, and Fawcett thinks the silent woman is, quote, like an automaton besides her lord. An old woman looks out above her veil and seems to Fawcett, quote, the very savor of the East. Now, though her descriptions of people can sometimes be condescending and even racist, Fawcett most often maintains the perspective of a respectful outsider. At the least, she is sensitive enough to recognize that to the Algerians she is, and I quote, equally exotic. The climax of the trip and of the essay is Fawcett's solitary exploration of the city's most fabled quarter, the Casbah. Vividly, Fawcett describes first her ascent to the Court of Miracles, where beauty and suffering, what she calls the farthest possibilities of mankind, meet, and then her descent to the quarter with its pattern that an inexperienced eye can glimpse but cannot follow. Unable to find her way, she grows increasingly fearful, but restrains an impulse to run, walking, as she writes, very erectly instead. When she returns the next day, she meets a Frenchwoman who warns her that the quarters are too dangerous to visit without an escort. Fawcett's courage is totally undermined. She will not enter the Casbah again, except under the Frenchwoman's guidance. The experience of difference, now carefully mediated, is safe. Indeed, in the home of the guy's Algerian friend, they, quote, exchange polite and admirable banalities after the fashion of ladies calling the world over. Analogically, Jessie Fossa was an unusually gifted, intellectually curious woman who was bound by cultural dictates. Frequently drawn to new territory, in art as in life, she was occasionally brave enough to enter it, but she was unlikely to remain once she realized where she was. The potential risk was too great, as much to the image she reflected as a proper Negro woman as to herself. The lessons of the Methodist parsonage of her childhood and those of the elite universities in which she studied made her a reluctant explorer. From this distance, it is perhaps too easy to see those instances where Jessie Fawcett's courage failed her. It is important to acknowledge the ways it did not. After all, how many other American women of her generation had even the desire to traverse the Casbah? How many fewer still could have found the means to make the journey? Okay. Now, I know that some of my friends from Hostess have been studying Zora Neale Hurston, so let me just say a few things about her. But I do want to encourage you, those of you who have not read Jessie Fawcett, and particularly Jessie Fawcett's essays, give them a look. She really is an unusual person. Many Renaissance artists preferred to explore the Negro homeland on this side of the Atlantic. The South, from which so many ordinary people fled, fired artists' imaginations, especially those like Zora Neale Hurston and James Weldon Johnson, both of whom had been born there. Langston Hughes was born in Missouri and grew up in Kansas and Ohio. The Washington, D.C. born Gene Toomer was reborn an artist in Georgia. He was captivated by the physical setting, the red clay, pine trees, and sugarcane, and transfixed by what he called the, quote, peculiar quality of dusk there. The expressive culture of Southern Black people, the folklore that included stories, sermons, spirituals, work songs, and blues, offered writers inspiration and models. Those stories and songs were not the work of the educated or the middle class. In Hurston's judgment, the Negro farthest down had made the greatest contribution to American culture. Some of her peers had no interest in unlettered rural Southerners who seemed left behind in that race to modernity. Others wanted to use their lore as raw material for works of literary art. Hurston, however, knew that the richly complex lore could stand on its own. Even so, she conceded while collecting it, quote, I picked up glints and gleams out of what I had and stored it away for my own use. Okay. When people think of writers, not these people, because this group is really on it, when some people used to think of artists of the Harlem Renaissance, they did not think of Bessie Smith or Alberta Hunter or Ida Cox or Ma Rainey. Yet these women achieved artistic maturity and enjoyed tremendous popular success during the same years their literary sisters published their books, short stories, and poems. They, too, the blues women, grappled with issues of identity, sought forms that could encompass the reality of their experience as Black women, and struggled to control their own voices. Unlike the literary women, however, the blues women worked within an aesthetic tradition that recognized their right to speak. Free of the burdens of an alien tradition, Bessie Smith could establish the standard of her art. In the process, she would compose a more honest poetry than many of her literary sisters. Consider, for example, Young Woman's Blues. Woke up this morning when chickens were calling for days, and on the right side of my pillow, my man had gone away. By the pillow, he left a note saying, "I'm sorry, Jane, you got my goat. No time to marry, no time to settle down. I'm a young woman and ain't done running round. I'm a young woman and ain't done running round. Some people call me a hobo, some call me a bum. Nobody knows my name, nobody knows what I've done. I'm as good as any woman in your town. I ain't high yellow, I'm a deep killer brown. I ain't gonna marry, ain't gonna settle down. I'm gonna drink good moonshine and run these browns down. See that long, lonesome road? Lord, you know it's gotta end. I'm a good woman, and I can get plenty men." Now, this poem's language and references immediately define the speaker and her setting as Black and Southern. Her tone expresses a complex mixture of bravado and vulnerability. She is a woman who, though resigned to life's broken promises and disappointments, refuses to let them defeat her. I'm a young woman and ain't done running around. Still, she is painfully aware of the judgment the world assigns. Hobo is most assuredly a euphemism. In the end, she draws strength only from an implicit faith that the future is not as bleak as it appears. The long, lonesome road must only seem endless. In the meantime, she boasts of her ability to attract new lovers. It is the only boast she has to make. She pledges to take joy where she can find it, and her words condemn a world that offers so little. Musicologist Ortiz Walton has written that, quote, "The blues as lyrics sung poetry is a medium through which passes the essence of the life experience, both its travails and its ecstasies." The truth of this statement is verified when one listens to Bessie Smith's recording of Young Woman's Blues, which despite its lyric is anything but despairing. And you all have YouTube, so when you can turn your phones back on, find Bessie Smith singing Young Woman's Blues on YouTube, and you'll understand what I'm saying. When she sings, "I'm going to drink good moonshine and run these browns down," the listener recognizes that life's pleasures, though transitory, are nonetheless real. Okay, now Bessie Smith was not a favorite of Alain Locke or James Weldon Johnson, or for that matter, of Jessie Fossa. I mean, I'm going to run men down, have lots of lovers. Oh my gosh, she doesn't care at all about respectability. That concept doesn't even register. That she's about surviving and surviving with an intact sense of self. And for that reason, Bessie Smith has become an icon for writers, particularly black women writers, up unto our present moment. For writers of the Harlem Renaissance, though, there's only one that really does connect with the world that Bessie Smith evokes in her music. And that is Zora Neale Hurston. And I'd like to end with just a little description of Hurston's life during the 1920s. In 1928, Zora Neale Hurston was in the field, living at the Everglades Cypress Lumber Camp in Lowman, Florida. Situated in Polk County, where the water tastes like cherry lime, the sawmill camp drew workers from across the South. Hurston recognized immediately that she had struck a mother lode of material. Folk tales, work songs, proverbs and sermons, children's rhymes and blues. In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, she gives a compressed, poetic account of her Polk County expedition. The blues ethos is unmistakable. Quote, Polk County, swinging, singing, laughing, cursing, boasting of last night's love, and looking forward to the darkness again. They do not say embrace when they mean slept with a woman. Everlasting love is a lie. Love is made and unmade. One welcomes it wherever it is found. Hurston quotes a blues that expresses a philosophy not only of love, but of life. Quote, got on the train, didn't have no fare, but I rode some, Got on the train, didn't have no fare. Conductor asked me what I'm doing there, but I rode some. Yes, I rode some. Well, he grabbed me by the collar and he led me to the door, but I rode some. Yes, I rode some. Well, he grabbed me by the collar and he led me to the door. He rapped me over the head with a 44, but I rode some. Yes, I rode some. Even on the printed page, the insistent refrain of this song resonates with what critic Stephen Henderson calls the survival motion inherent in the blues. The folk singer insists on the value and breadth of his life, realizing that the powerful had neither granted him permission to live it, nor understood that he had. The song duly records the oppressive circumstances of the singer's life, but more important, it proclaims his triumph over them. In doing so, it expresses a central premise of Hurston's work. Material poverty is not tantamount to spiritual poverty or to experiential deprivation. Life in the Polk counties of the nation was complex and rich, as the blues and other vernacular forms confirm. It would be a tremendous loss to the Negro race and America, Hurston once told a reporter, if we should lose the folklore and folk music, for the unlettered Negro has given the Negro's best contribution to American life. In keeping with this belief, the sources of Hurston's imagination and the texture of her prose are radically different from those of her female contemporaries. No tragic mulattoes, people her fiction, characters do not ponder emotional dilemmas while pouring tea. Plots do not resolve themselves in sentimental cliches. The reasons for these differences are several, but one of the most important is suggested by the affinity between Hurston's aesthetic and that of the blues singer. Zora Neale Hurston was the one literary woman who was free to embrace Bessie Smith's art, who was also heir to the legacy evoked in the blues. As a daughter of the rural South, Hurston claimed the legacy by birthright. As an anthropologist, she reclaimed it through years of intense, often perilous research. As a writer, She summoned this legacy in her choice of setting, her delineation of character, and most devotedly in her distillation of language. All these elements provided sharp contrast to other writers. With a keen sensitivity to the rhythms of Southern Black speech, Hurston had recorded the language of informants in the field. She understood the priority placed on verbal agility in Black expressive culture. As the blueswoman fashioned her lyrics from the storehouse of the rural blues, Hurston drew from the repository of African American oral tradition to construct a literary language that is distinctly her own. Thank you.
People can't live by bread alone. They need intellectual, cultural stimulation. They need science. They need poetry. They need the imagination. They need the poetic spirit. They need books in addition to bread. And you get those books here at Revolution Books. But you know what? We need bread to get the books to provide you with the inspiration, the science, the poetic spirit. We launched this crowdfunding campaign last night, and we are raising $25,000 for the bookstore About the World for a Radically Different World, the bookstore that changes lives. And what I want to do right now is premiere before this audience, and Cheryl, maybe you could just step down because I want you to see this.
No, I do.
Okay. So this is the video that we just produced about the fund drive, and it's 4 minutes, and we'll watch that. I'm just going to say a few more words about our upcoming programs afterward, and then we're going to have some conversation and open it up to you, okay?
Stumbled in here to Revolution Books today looking for a book, and I'm very happy that I came in here because I ended up gaining a lot more than just a book.
I didn't plan to come here today, but something just told me to just come and check. So I came in, I did what I could, and let's say I found much more than I expected to. I found much more adventure than I was really hoping for one day. And I read books, I saw this, which actually inspired me to read a book. Then you started speaking to me about revolution, and it really got me going.
When you support Revolution Books, you're supporting a whole lot of people learning about how the world got this way. You're supporting young people being able to stretch their minds, because the education system we have is absolute garbage, and it's about to get a whole lot worse.
And when I got this invitation and they said it's Revolution Books, it was in Harlem, I thought, well, it couldn't be the same bookstore that my dad used to take me to. But then I went on the website and I realized that the bookstore, it is the same bookstore. It's just moved, and it's moved up here. I want to honor everybody that's built this place and made it such a welcoming community.
I just want more places like this to exist, to thrive.
If this is your first time in the store, get this or this and start from there.
The reality of the world today holds the possibility and potential for something far better. And to unlock that, we have at the foundation of Revolution Books the most advanced scientific revolutionary theory for revolution and for the full emancipation of humanity in the new synthesis of communism brought forward by the revolutionary leader, Bob Avakian.
What if we lived in a world where never again would that soul-wrenching experience that never leaves of having to bury your own child whose life was stolen by a brutal thug with a gun and the backing of the powers that be.
This is a unique historical moment.
The fact is, a revolution is possible, yes, even in this belly of the beast.
They've already begun stuff that is going to be very hard to undo. If we let them continue, this thing could be lost for generations.
Ness would fall asleep to the images of men being thrown into the Atlantic Ocean like anchors attached to nothing. No land, no people, no worth.
A couple of years ago, I walked down the street and I saw the storefront, and I cannot say how excited I was to have Revolution Books in my neighborhood. I remember when it was down in Chelsea, and now I have a daughter, and I just think that growing up, being able to come here to see the kind of things that I didn't see often in Mississippi means so much to me, and I really want this store to survive, and I want it to be here forever.
Now, you saw in that film Bob Avakian at the dialogue on Revolution and Religion with Cornel West. And his work, his vision, his leadership, this scientific approach to understanding the world and making a revolution that can truly emancipate humanity is at the heart of this bookstore. This Saturday, we're going to be showing at 7 o'clock the second installment of a film, of a talk by Bob Avakian, Revolution, Nothing Less. I want to invite all of you to come out Saturday night, at 6:30. Saturday night at 6:30 here. Mark your calendar, tell your friends. We're going to show this second installment, and then we're going to have a discussion about it. And what he gets into in this installment is, why do we need a revolution to put an end to oppression? Is it possible to solve these problems within the framework of the system? Or do we really need a revolution? Why? And why is it that we need socialism and communism? What are they? Why couldn't we just have more and better democracy as the solution? He goes into it. And then he goes into the strategy for revolution in this installment. So I want to invite all of you to come and be part of that experience this Saturday night film at Revolution Books. Okay? So now we're going to open up into our discussion. I want to ask Cheryl 2 or 3 questions, and then I know you in the audience are going to comment, right, and come in. Listen, one thing that struck me in reading both books, you make the point, I forget where, but you make the point that the Harlem Renaissance represented the first time since the rupturing, the sundering of identity and community and continuity represented by slavery. In other words, this was the first time that a new unity, the phrase is, a new unity of the Negro was forged during this Harlem Renaissance. The first time since slavery destroyed what was, different peoples in Africa. So I was wondering, that to me was a very sort of striking observation about the significance, the momentousness of the Harlem Renaissance. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Absolutely. I mean, there had been other movements, certainly for progress. There have been many political movements in the period of Reconstruction and the period into the turn of the 20th century. But one thing that I think was different about the New Negro movement and about Harlem in particular was this was a community where people had come together from everywhere. I mean, there were black people from the rural South. There were black people from the Caribbean. There were even black people from the continent who all were here in this community. For writers, it made a huge difference. There'd been Paul Laurence Dunbar had written poetry in the 19th century. The novelist Charles Chestnut had published some very important novels in the the turn of the 20th century. But they were pretty much solitary figures. Langston Hughes knew Zora Neale Hurston. Count Cullen knew Gwendolyn Bennett. And they are here, and they can talk about their work. They can get together and publish journals, both the official journals of the NAACP and the National Urban League, a journal called Opportunity. There's a socialist journal that A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owens published called The Messenger. And there's a little literary journal called Fire. And that only happens because people are together. It would be great. You could want to write poetry, and I'm sure people did write poetry in Meridian, Mississippi, which I mentioned because that's my mother's hometown. But that would be one person really getting the sense that she was out there by herself. In Harlem, I think the numbers make the difference. There's much more freedom just from the terror of the Ku Klux Klan, from the exploitation of sharecropping and other exploitative labor systems in the South. It just makes people feel that they can come together and move forward.
Kind of related to that in terms of what the raw materials for a lot of the work in especially in writing and the visual arts. You make the point that I'd like to hear you say a little more about, that really one of the distinctive elements of the Renaissance was the fusion of the folkloric or the primitive with the modernist, and that gave it a distinctive energy. And that was both, it seems to me, maybe reading between the lines, both an aesthetics and also perhaps a political stance as well. But what more can you say about this fusion of the primitive in a non-pejorative sense of the word that was being bandied about, right? I know you comment on that, and you take, I mean, correctly, you're taking issue with the way it's bandied about. But there was the folkloric and that which had been dismissed as the non-art. But then with the modernist, the avant-garde, if you will. What about that fusion? That was, to me, part of the energy of this thing.
It absolutely was. Now, I'm bristling at primitive, but that's not a term I like.
I set that up for you.
Because it's very hard. It's one of those terms that people think that they can reclaim, and I don't think it's really reclaimable, because what would be the antithesis of the primitive? Okay. Black people understood they were already civilized. They didn't need to be civilized. They were civilized. But there is this sense that there are forms of expression that we now think of as folklore. Zora Neale Hurston has a wonderful phrase that folklore is the art of a people before they know there is such a thing as art. Okay? Folklore is the art of a people before they know there's such a thing as art. So Hurston is looking around and she's saying, wow, there's wonderful art everywhere. There are people, there's singers, there are dancers, there are people who make art out of everyday conversation. And she had that sensibility, and not everybody has quite that sensibility. So James Weldon Johnson understands that there is an art in the down-home preacher's sermon. And he writes a wonderful book called God's Trombones, 7 Sermons in Verse, that's published in 1927. The most famous poem from that collection is called The Creation. Now, when I was a child in a church in Harlem, 142nd Street between 7th and 8th Avenue, and they would have programs, on occasion somebody would get up and recite the creation. I'm not even sure the reciter recognized that this was from a book by a poet named James Weldon Johnson, because somehow Johnson's work was so close to the source that it went back to the source. And that there were preachers who would use that and without any attribution, because they kind of thought of it as folklore. Now, I'm sure that would not always have pleased James Weldon Johnson on the one hand. On the other hand, it meant he got it right. Okay? And so there are these writers who, and they're not just writers, they're also musicians. I was at the Schomburg today doing some research on a musician from the 1920s. And of course, the 1920s is also a time when the spirituals are reclaimed. Now, we're 60 years after emancipation, and there have been some black people at the turn of the century who say, we don't want anything to do with those slave songs. That's the past. We don't want anything to do with the past. And then in the 1920s, you have, most famously, Marian Anderson, who begins her career. I'm looking at young people. My students don't know who Marian Anderson was, but look her up too. And then there's Paul Robeson. Now, my students at Rutgers know Paul Robeson because Paul Robeson is the most famous graduate of Rutgers, and they know him. But Paul Robeson in 1925 was the first singer to give a concert entirely made up of what were called Negro spirituals. He didn't sing German lieder. There was not an Italian aria. It was all spirituals. And that sense that this is art. We don't have to go to Europe to look for art. We've been creating art all of the time. And then there are writers like Langston Hughes, who becomes the poet laureate of Harlem, and who is the first person to publish blues poetry, the first person to invent jazz poetry, because he had this sensibility that what he was hearing around him was in fact the stuff of art. And I do think the Harlem Renaissance is a very important moment for that understanding.
Well, the last question I want to ask, it's a two-parter, so I'm smuggling in a fourth. You mentioned that the Harlem Renaissance was rediscovered. And in at least your, in the reading here on offer, there are two moments that are very critical. One is the Black Arts Movement, which was deeply rooted here in Harlem in the 1960s. And then there's women writers like Alice Walker. And these are two moments and episodes of rediscovery, and a lot is done with this. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that in terms of the legacy and how this was rediscovered, and what was affirmed and what was, parted with. And the other part of my question is, here I want to put you on the spot. What would, in your estimation, be the main weakness of the Harlem Renaissance?
Okay, let me do the weakness first and then go to the strength. All right, the main weakness was there weren't audiences that could support the art. There weren't black audiences that could support the art. And artists had to rely on patrons, and once one relies on a patron, it's very difficult to maintain the integrity of one's art. And that was a challenge that Langston Hughes faced, and Neale Hurston faced, and Richmond Barthé faced. This Richmond Barthé was a sculptor. And all three of them at one time shared the same patron. And so that was a key difficulty. And another key difficulty was the onset of the Depression, which meant that even people who in the 1920s could buy books, in the Depression, books became a luxury for working people. And so those two things, I think, are two of the weaknesses. Now, why people went back to the Harlem Renaissance, when I think of the Black Arts Movement, there is a writer who's not as well known as Amiri Baraka, but who worked very closely with Amiri Baraka, whose name was Larry Neale. And Larry Neale was one of the first people to rediscover Zora Neale Hurston. Zora Neale Hurston passed away in 1960. All of her books were out of print. Nobody knew really nobody knew anything about her. Her legacy had pretty much disappeared. Well, Larry Neale in 1971, with J.P. Lippincott, who had been Hurston's original publisher, brought several of her books, Dust Tracks on a Road and Jonas Gourdvine, two of them, back into print. And that made it possible for students like me to encounter Zora Neale Hurston on the page. And that was it was incredibly important and exciting. And if Alice Walker is Hurston's most visible champion, but there are lots of references to Zora Neale Hurston's work in other Black women writers from the 1970s. It's in Toni Morrison. Okay? It's in Maya Angelou. It's in Ntasaki Shange. That you can see that these writers have discovered Hurston, and she's important both as a model, as Alice Walker makes so eloquently clear, that writers need models, and that she wanted to know that there had been another. Or let me rephrase that she was not the first poor, Black, rural girl who wanted to be an artist. And she then discovered that there had been generations of Black women artists before her, of whom Zora Neale Hurston was to her the most important. That was incredibly empowering. And I think that those are the moments that people go back and they say, I'm not the first one to do this. I'm not the first one who has ideas and passions that I want to express and give some artistic form to. And having these precursors, and at the end of Walker's essay, Looking for Zora, which is very powerful and moving and wonderful. It's also funny, because Zora Neale Hurston never lost the ability to laugh, no matter how difficult her life was. And at the end of that essay, when Walker has gone in search of Hurston's grave, which she really can't find, so she just decides that's it, and marks Hurston's grave. And she talks about that moment as being intensely painful, but also a moment in which greater disciplines are born. Okay? And I think that's the other reason for artists that it's so important to have this sense that we don't, Walker also says we as a people can't throw our geniuses away. They've got to be reclaimed. And they've got to be, their work has got to be preserved. And I think that spirit is one that continues to make things possible for artists and for those of us who are not artists but are the recipients and participants in art.
Okay, so let's open it up to the audience. It's a good mix here tonight. People who are studying and discovering the Harlem Renaissance, and other people who have come to the bookstore and have been part of other discussions here. So let's see a show of hands, and we'll take the microphone to you. All right? I see a hand in the front, but let's see all the hands first, so I can get a sense of. There's two here. I know that. Okay, and the person in the green shirts. Let's take this first round, okay? We'll do one at a time first, and then we'll consolidate if we need to later. Okay?
Good evening. My name is Nash. I'm a student at Hostos. I'm with my professor. It's a two-part question. Okay. So the first part is we discussed in class how the Harlem Renaissance was the seed for the civil rights movement. And I was hoping if you can touch on that. Mm-hmm. And we also discussed how the Harlem Renaissance was somewhat, if not the beginning, touched upon Black consciousness. And I was hoping if you can touch on that as well, if you agree, if not, and discuss why.
Okay. Let me take the second part first. I see you started something with this two-part question, but okay. This notion about consciousness, I once wrote a piece for a high school textbook, and I said that race pride was an important part of the Harlem Renaissance, and it was a kind of precursor of the Black is Beautiful movement of the 1960s. And I had a colleague who was furious. You can't write that because Black is Beautiful, that's from the 1960s. That's not from the 1920s. And I said, well, it's not from the 1920s, the phrase, but the spirit is definitely part of the 1920s. When I said before that one of the things that the poets of the 1920s did was to invert that color symbolism, that dark is always bad, that white is purity, and Black is sinful, that there's no beauty in Blackness. And then you have Count Cullen writing about plants, flowers that only bloom at night. So what is that? But a way of saying that Black things are also beautiful, that Black people are also beautiful. Beautiful are the faces of my people, writes Langston Hughes. And I do think that's a very important start. You know, I think consciousness precedes action, right? So unless one is conscious, one can't really do anything. And so I think in terms of the Harlem Renaissance, anticipating the social movements that come afterward, I think part of that anticipation is the change that is made in Black people's consciousness. Okay. Yes, to an extent, the Harlem Renaissance is a precursor of the Civil Rights Movement, but mainly in that these organizations, whether it's the NAACP or whether it's the National Association of, I'm going to get that, National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. I mean, there are, that spirit of organizing does then begin to bear more explicitly political fruit later in the 20th century, so yes.
Okay, here.
So, I hope I can put it right. My question is, with the new face of Harlem, I'm kind of worried that a lot of the history will get lost. How do we maintain that history so that it doesn't get lost? And, you know, things like the Harlem Renaissance and everything will be taught to our generation, younger generation.
Absolutely, thank you. That's an excellent question. I was telling Jane and Raymond at dinner that I spent a lot of my girlhood in Harlem, and that I am keenly aware of the changes in Harlem, and I mean, because I'm a woman of a certain age, I've seen many changes in Harlem, and the current gentrification of Harlem is of deep concern to me. In terms of preserving the history, I have to say I have spent this afternoon and 3 hours this afternoon and 5 hours yesterday afternoon at the Schomburg. And I think it's absolutely crucial that those of us who care about the history support institutions like the Schomburg. That's where our history is being preserved. And that is, and the Schomburg, those of you who haven't been recently, there's a show up now about the Black Power movement. It's really powerful. And we just have to be intentional about these things, because if not, things don't just happen. You have to work to make them happen. And I think that the history to be preserved, people have to really commit themselves and dedicate themselves to its preservation.
Revolution Books is also a resource for the history of Harlem. We have a shelf of books that are about Harlem, and our fund drive has one of its purposes to raise funds to get new books, and we want to expand our selection of books on that. And we are bringing leading scholars like Cheryl to this bookstore to share her research and her insights with a new generation. So this is something that we have to fight to do and collaborate in all the ways that we can, and we look forward to that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Someone in the green shirt, I recall. Yeah.
Hi. Do you have any thoughts about Zora Neale Hurston's writings or speakings about some of her political views that have caused controversy and seem to be full of contradictions and complexity?
She was a woman who was full of contradictions. And I say to people, I mean, Hurston's fiction has been deeply important to me. I think her folklore, books like Mules and Men, I think is just a wonderful resource. In fact, I read Mules and Men as the history from the ground up. It's not the official history, but it's kind of, folklore is a kind of people's history. It's how people, ordinary people, remember and represent the past. Hurston's political ideology, I do not try to recuperate, because Hurston's a conservative, and as she aged, she grew more and more reactionary. Now, part of that, I would suggest, is that she grows more and more isolated. Once she leaves New York, she's in Florida. She's really living a hard scrabble existence. And she also she no longer has a community of thinkers around her. And she also had some personal reasons to be embittered. And I think those things combined to really cause her to have a very backward and reactionary politics. And even, I mean, one of the more controversial things Hurston did was in 1955. It was 1955. She wrote a letter to the editor of the Orlando Sentinel newspaper, which was the main newspaper in Orlando, Florida. Eatonville, her hometown, is really, if the people had not fought so hard over the past 25 years to keep Eatonville, or as they call it, to preserve Eatonville, Eatonville would have been, would be now part of Orlando. It was that close to Orlando. And Hurston had really believed that she grew up in a special place because she grew up in an all-black town. And with the Supreme Court decision of 1954, she felt that that decision was invalidating some of her experience. So she writes this letter to the Orlando Sentinel, where she pretty much says, that decision, Brown v. Board, that was a mistake. It was an insult to black people. It was not an insult to black people. It has has made my life possible, has made the lives of everybody I know possible in ways that just, so Hurston was, in my view, usually wrong politically, although there are parts of her legacy that I don't want to throw away, and I won't throw away.
I think she was always, wait, let's get the mic, hold on. Just wanted to throw in.
Okay.
Do you think that she was ever just trying to stir up the debate and not necessarily fully believe, like Bob Dylan, there's questions about some of his views?
Sometimes she does like to shock people, and I think in her personal, how shall I say, the way she moves through the world, was often to provoke a reaction. And so there is some of that too. But I do think that she was serious about the Board v. Brown. Mm-hmm.
Other hands, comments?
They've been such a good audience.
Yeah, but wait, wait! The class is here. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity. Come on, take advantage of it. Okay. What?
We just started Zora Neale Hurston yesterday.
I am not putting. I am. We got two great questions. Yeah. 2.5 questions. We got that
There's
sneaky.
Another one.
Right. Let's go.
Okay.
Hello there. My name is G. I teach Zora Neale Hurston's The Eyes of Watching God in my high school. And, we always have a great deal of discussion about the last part of the book when, of course, Tea Cakes in the Everglades hits her, right? Janie, to show that, she actually belongs to him.
Yeah.
Well, how do you read that troubling incident, shall we say, because of course it's reminiscent of how Joe, her first husband, treated her as well, but there is very little explicit criticism in the novel about what Tea Cake does.
The most troubling moment in that otherwise wonderful, evocative, and empowering for women and for Black people and for people in general novel. I would again go back to Alice Walker, who has a wonderful insight about that, where she points out that is the only chapter in Their Eyes Were Watching God in which Janie does not speak. She speaks in every other chapter from the beginning to the end. And so although there's not an explicit critique, the kind of critique that we as readers in 2017 want, somebody say this is wrong, this is unacceptable, are you kidding? There is, I think, an implicit critique that does, go along with some of the other social critique in the novel. I mean, there were lots of there are 3 male writers in particular who had a lot of difficulty with Their Eyes Were Watching God. Richard Wright was one, Ralph Ellison was another, and Sterling Brown was another. And they wanted, because where's the social critique? Where is the anger at racism? Or Wright went so far as to say there wasn't an idea in the book. Now, if we think sexism is not only an idea but a political position, then I think there are ideas and politics. And their eyes were watching God. But sometimes it's not explicit in ways that I think readers sometimes want and expect. But I think if we read carefully, we can find it. One last thing. Tea Cake is punished in that novel.
Cheryl, you're touching on a question that I thought was posed in a very living way during the Harlem Renaissance, and that is, what is the role and the responsibility of the African American artist vis-a-vis the liberation of the African American people? Because I think this question was, it's here. People are taking a stand on Zora because I think her political positions are unacceptable. You spoke to that. Yeah, I'm talking about that.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm talking about that, not across the board, but what you were describing. But there is this debate about the role of the artist of an oppressed people, and how does that art serve the cause of, how does it serve the cause, and how does it remain art? And the tension thereof. So I think it'd be interesting to hear you speak about that.
It's one of the central tensions of the Harlem Renaissance. I said there were some. W.B. Du Bois was very out front about all art is propaganda, and he's interested in propaganda for the Negro as opposed to against the Negro. And if it's not propaganda in favor of the Negro, he's not interested in it. So what good does it do? And then there are other positions. One of the most eloquent is Langston Hughes, the Negro artist and the racial mountain, where he's saying that the artist has the right to express himself or herself as they please. And he says, and sometimes, white people will be angry, and that's all right. Sometimes Black people will be angry, And that's all right, because the artist has to say and do what his imagination, what his will, what his passion leads him to do. We have to remember, and I mean, there are variations of this debate up till right now. The pressure that's on Black artists, I mean, most recently, it's really been, and you all can talk more knowledgeably about this than I can, but it's some of the debates around hip-hop. Oh, okay. Because why are you putting all these negative images out there? That's not helpful. Why would you do that? We ought to be putting positive images. Oh my gosh, positive images in the movies, positive images in videos, positive. And artists really, if you ask, I say to my students sometimes, can you imagine? Do you write poetry? And every time somebody will say, well, yeah. Okay. Now, can you imagine that when you sit down to write a poem, you are not just sitting down to say, oh my gosh, do I have an idea? Can I think of the images? What is the form for this poem? How can I express this? How can I write this poem? But think if you also are saying, is this poem good for Black people? Is this poem going to advance progress of Black people? Or white people? Or gay people? Or Latino people? I mean, this is such a burden, I think, in terms of representation for the artist. And that's why the little journal Fire was, and there's only one issue of Fire, 1926, lasted one issue because it cost $1, which was a lot of money. And these were artists, Langston Hughes, Neale Hurston, Countee Cullen, Wallace Thurman, Gwendolyn Bennett, who were really responding against this pressure to just produce positive images. Now, as it so happens, some of those are the Harlem Renaissance writers whose work we historically think of as the most important. Okay? And it's not that they didn't think that they wanted to make progress possible for Black people. Of course they did. I mean, I think everybody wants that to happen. But this idea that each poem, each short story, each novel is going to be judged by that criteria alone, I think people really said that's just too much, that's too great a burden for me to carry. I want to be able to express my own Black self in the way that I feel is appropriate.
That's a discussion that goes on here at Revolution Books. And it's also an important feature of the new synthesis of communism that Bob Avakian has brought forward. And I would encourage people to dig into this. There's a collection of essays called Observations on Art, Culture, Science, in which he speaks about some of the historical problems in the communist movement where there were tendencies to reduce art to political agitation and political propaganda. Are you motioning that I'm, what? You can't hear me? I'm sorry. That there are these tendencies to formularize, art on the one hand, and not to have that space to create. On the other hand, there is an important role for art that is conveying, a message of transformation and revolution, art of high artistic value and revolutionary content that raises people's sights to a whole new world. That is not what all artists can or should or would want to do. But there's a very important role for that kind of art. And the interesting thing is, in periods of great upsurge, for instance in the 60s, you did have an incredible flowering of creativity in association with the defiance and the rebellion of a period. So these are things that we get into here at the bookstore, and I really, again, would encourage, this kind of question. We don't want to have I would encourage people to look at the Constitution for the New Socialist Republic in North America. That's a vision and a framework for a new socialist society on the road to a world without communism, a world without oppression and exploitation, a communist world. And there's a discussion on the role of art and how art would be, funded and carried out. And the fact is that people need art. They need art. They need the imagination. They need, the envisioning of what could be and what is not and what should be, and the exploration of the human spirit. These are all very important towards the kind of society that we want to create, where human beings can truly flourish, and where you do have people engaged in changing the world and changing themselves. And culture plays a very important role there in terms of values. Values. I mean, and all art is expressing some view of the world, whether the artist is aware of that or not.
Oh, absolutely. I just, I have to say that at the end, G brought up Their Eyes Watching God. And at the end of Their Eyes Watching God, as Janie has told her story to her best friend, she calls her kissing friend, Phoebe. Phoebe said, Janie, and I'm just going to be close, may not be exact, I done grow 10 feet taller just listening to you. Okay? And so there is that sense, and I think so. I absolutely have that feeling, and I have, it's not a feeling, it's a belief, that art does give us senses of new possibility. We can imagine worlds that we had not envisioned before, and all of us who read books. And yes, I will put in my plug for our Revolution books. Come back here, and just all kinds of new possibilities are available to us if we read. And just to say one last thing, so many young people, and I understand it, though I have to say I love the idea, Raymond, that you told people that they had to turn off their cell phones. I felt as though I was in my classroom when I tell people they have to turn off any device that has an on and off switch, and they look at me like, are you kidding? But they do it. And the reason, I think books, unlike media, media, and it shares the etymology with mediated, that what you get from this media, somebody else, something else is in between you and that experience. When you're reading a book, it's you and the words on the page. And so just keep that in mind, and try to get more of your information and more of your aesthetic pleasure from reading. It's a free space.
Did you have was that a hand that was going? Oh, okay. I didn't know. I don't want to miss anyone. Okay, we're going to take, it's now 8:45. We have the people are here. We want to have time for people to get their books and talk with Cheryl, get their books signed, and talk with the staff of Revolution Books to learn more about the store and our fund drive. You want to ask one quick question or make a comment? Sure.
Okay.
It's coming. The mic is coming.
So, thank you, first of all, for coming here. It was amazing to hear you speak about this subject, which, I have I had some knowledge of, from a political, mostly perspective of, sort of the shift that was going on around the time of the Great Migration, but not so much from the artistic perspective, which is kind of an indictment of our education system, and maybe myself. Thinking of the comment that you made earlier about how, the new culture that was being forged by the Harlem Renaissance was not just becoming the culture of Black America, but America overall. And this was really transforming a whole social consciousness, and, thinking about the potential that, Black people play in America for really actually changing the way, America sees itself and the world sees America. And, around the time of the Harlem Renaissance, here you had people who, who, after the sort of the great struggle between two modes of production, slavery and capitalism, the Civil War, and then the betrayal of Reconstruction. Here you had a whole people being, going from one form of exploitation to another form of exploitation, which comes with, sort of the different contradictions, and people are being thrown into a whole other way of being. And then, like the poem that you read, Bessie Smith, the song, where she's being called all of these things, and here she is completely defiant in the face of that. And, here you have, anyway, all of that is going on, right? And then later on, this is inspiring the movement in the 60s where Black people, again, Black people are really rising up, and this is inspiring a whole generation. And then it's a global impact, really, the struggle, of Black people. And, while you were saying, it made me think of this quote, actually, from BA, which I wanted to read and then get maybe your thought on it, and this relates more to even the struggle, the final struggle for emancipation, right? The sort of the resolution of that deep defining contradiction at the base of America, which is what is going to be the situation of Black people? Because in America, sort of the future that's been written thus far is genocide, to put it, that way. But then there is potential for something else to come from that. And I think Black people have a role to play, not only in exposing this genocide, but also actually taking things in a whole other direction. So here's the quote. There is the potential for something of unprecedented beauty to rise out of unspeakable ugliness. Black people playing a crucial role in putting an end, at long last, to this system, which has for so long not just exploited, but dehumanized, terrorized, and tormented them in 1,000 ways. Putting an end to this in the only way that it can be done, by fighting to emancipate humanity, to put an end to the long night in which human society has been divided into masters and slaves, and the masses of humanity have been lashed, beaten, raped, slaughtered, shackled, and shrouded in ignorance and misery. Right, and that's from BA. And I sort of wanted to throw that into the conversation. We're talking about the role of the artist. Well, what about the role of the masses of Black people in actually not just exposing what the system does, but presenting a whole other way?
I cannot equal the eloquence of your comment, let alone the quotation, which is also eloquent and powerful, but of your comment. And you work here? You are part of Revolution Books? Well, this is the most eloquent testimony to the power of this space that we are likely to hear tonight. So I would commend you for your insight as well as your eloquence. And I cannot, I think that change is coming. I just am always an optimist about it, and sometimes, it seems that the optimism is not well placed, but I just believe I come from generations of people who could only have survived with optimism. There's so many times that there was nothing for them to imagine, literally, and yet they imagined something. And they believed that there was a better world, and a better world, if not for them, for their children. That is who I am. That's how I got here, and I just have to hold on to that belief. So thank you so very much.
And let's thank Cheryl Wall so much.